Welcome to this session. I'll ask the panel maybe to sit in the panel. Ken, you can sit where you like because you're going to move in a minute. Are we missing?
We're missing Chris, but I
Chris.
expect he'll come back.
I'm sure he will. We won't ask where he's been. Okay. Welcome along. My name's Rob Christley. I'm from the University of Liverpool, and I'll be chairing this session on Ask the Editor, or Ask the Editors, as the case may be. This session is sponsored by Wiley, and they would like me to say that Wiley, as the publisher of the Equine Veterinary Journal and Equine Veterinary Education, is delighted to be sponsoring this session, Ask the Editor. EVJ and EVE are both essential resources for anyone working in the field of equine medicine. Working with the editors, we frequently highlight key content and produce exclusive online themed collections of articles. BEVA members receive a print copy of both journals and are able to access them online for free at Wiley Online Library or via the journal apps released earlier this year. As well as EVJ and EVE, Wiley published several other journals covering a range of disciplines in veterinary medicine, as well as many equine books. You can find out more about these at their website, wiley.com/go/vet. Thank you. And I do need to declare some affiliations. Obviously, I work at the University of Liverpool, and I am the statistical editor at Equine Veterinary Journal. And I'll just very briefly introduce our esteemed panel today. We have Ken Hinchcliffe, who's the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Veterinary Internal Medicine. Chris Lamb is associate editor with Veterinary Radiology and Ultrasound. Tim Mayer, editor-in-chief of the aforementioned Equine Veterinary Education. Tom Stout is the deputy editor of Equine Veterinary Journal, and Celia Marr is editor-in-chief of the Equine Veterinary Journal. So there's lots of people that you can gain a lot of information from here. Wealth of experience, and I guess the panel has a wealth of experience not only in those editorial roles, but as writers of papers who have been through the process from that side, reviewers of papers as well. So hopefully we're up for an interesting discussion. It's really, what we really want to do is give you, the audience, potential to ask questions, seek out answers to some of those things that have been bothering you about publications. I guess perhaps some examples might be good, but hopefully not too personal. I guess, so we're really looking for input from the floor, and we'll address things as best we can. And of course, everybody is willing to is welcome to comment and provide their input as well to whoever's question. Can I just ask that when you're speaking, you first state your name, and that if you're making a comment or asking a question, try and limit yourself to just one at a time. You're more than welcome to come back and ask more or say more things, but just try and do it one at a time just to keep things flowing. We're going to use very occasionally, I think, what's it called? Turning point, little handheld things. Has everyone got one of those? Anybody missing one? Who wants one? Okay, so I thought it might be useful to start just by finding out a little bit about you, okay, and your experience of, you can't really read that, experience of publishing clinical research. So we've got 5 statements here, and I just want you to press the number next to, or that corresponds with the statement that best describes you. So I've never published, and I never want to. I've not yet published, but I will soon. I've published, and I find it a bruising experience. I've published, and there's sometimes difficulties, but usually we get through, and I've published, and it's easy, straightforward. Okay. 13 responses, couple more. Let's try and get to 15. Come on. 15. Any raise on 15? How many people are here? That's about it, right. Okay, so the answer is, there we go. So we've got quite a feet people who have not yet published, but aim to soon. That's great. I think hopefully this is a forum where some of your questions can be answered. And we've got quite a number of people with some experience who, I think like most of us, I'd be surprised if there are too many people out there who think it's always straightforward. It is a difficult process getting published. From the 47%. It is. How about that? And there's a number of us here, 3, who have found a bruising experience. And I mean, I don't know. I would probably struggle to decide whether I would answer 3 or 4. I think at times it can be quite bruising and demoralising, and other times we get there. Okay, So we have some experience here. We have some people who really, I hope, want to ask some questions about the whole process, what they can expect. What I thought would be useful is perhaps just, this is supposed to be about clinical research, although I guess we might dive off into other areas. So I thought it might be just useful to try and define clinical research. So could I ask anyone from the panel, Celia, perhaps, if you could give what, as EVJ editor, what you think is a...
I think it's quite hard. It's possibly easier to talk about clinically relevant research. So clinically relevant research might be done at a cell level, a subcellular level, right through to a whole population level. When you use the phrase clinical research, I think it involves naturally occurring disease. Using the clinic floor as the laboratory is a phrase that I haven't heard in a long while, but Joe Mayhew used to use that phrase. And maybe the clinic floor as the laboratory is somewhere the place that questions get generated. But it's hard, yeah. Those are my first thoughts. I'm going to pass it along. And
I think that it does raise an important distinction, I guess, between research that's useful to the clinician and also those that really derive from the clinical practice.
I think some of it is the question you're trying to ask and or answer. So it is more the relevance, and there can be a number of ways of approaching that. And it could also be, of course, as we discussed earlier, a questionnaire to people, and it's not then dealing with the animals, it's dealing with their experience, but it's still clinically relevant, and I guess therefore clinical research. So it is I guess it's what you set out to do and where you think you're going to take the field with the answers that you generate.
Thanks. I think it depends on your perspective as to whether you're the information user or the information generator. And if you're the information user, then it's information that will help you improve the health or well-being of the animals. That's clinical to me. If you're the generator, it usually refers to where that information is created or sourced. And that, for clinical research, to me, it implies that you're looking at either naturally or perhaps induced disease, but probably much more frequently natural disease in the situation, in a clinical or a real-world situation. So, are you a user or a producer? And it depends.
Do we have perhaps anyone want to comment from the floor? I mean, I think the aim of this afternoon really is to give people a forum in which to ask questions. So, you can take any of the definitions or nuances of those definitions that you want to, really. So, really, we're interested in research that is of interest to people at BEVA, and the sorts of things you might like to hear here. Okay, so, I mean, we've got some things that we can talk about and some issues that we can raise, but again, we'll start, if possible, by seeing if there's any particular issues that anybody wants to raise from the floor. So please feel free to shoot up your hand and bring a topic to our attention. Do we have one? Somebody's going to be brave. Thank you. Thank you, Renata.
Renata Weller, Royal Veterinary College. See, what was that? What did you just say?
so it's going to be about reviewers, I know it is.
It is. Well, this is exactly my question. I want to ask the combined expertise, editorial expertise up there, whether you think that the current system of peer review and the reviewing process is sustainable, and if so, how you're going to achieve that. And there's two reasons why I'm asking this. First, from a reviewer's point, it takes me 1 or 2 days to do a thorough review, which obviously I could write a paper myself. And how can I justify that to my employer that I don't do that? Or I could write a grant application, or I could see clinical cases. And the second question, I guess, is how do you ensure that the quality of the review? Because my personal experience is that it has gone downhill a little bit over the last few years.
Or maybe you've got more discriminating.
Maybe.
Okay, so I'm going to start and then I'm going to pass the microphone right down the line. The peer review process started in Scotland during the Scottish Enlightenment. And it has stood the test of time, but I don't think there is any editor or peer reviewer who would say that it is a perfect system. I think it's probably the best of a bad world, but at the end of the day, the usual formula is 2 individuals express an opinion and then maybe 1 or 2 editors action that. And so I think it's very important as editors that we don't regard this as absolutely robust. So we have like most journals, they have an appeals process, and EVJ has an appeals process, and the underlying philosophy is to give people a second chance if they feel that they have reason to believe that the peer reviewers have missed the point or whatever. What authors often don't ask themselves is, well, if the reviewers have missed the point, might that be because you haven't made your point? But anyway, so it's important that we don't regard this as a gold standard, can never be wrong process. The next point, is it justifiable to your employer? Well, it's you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You want to publish. The norm in our world is that it involves peer review. If you expect others, and you know as well as I do that peer reviewers get nothing directly, they don't get paid, it can be time consuming, and so forth. So the idea really is it's the community. I submit a paper, you review it, next time you submit a paper, someone else reviews it. And it's also to some extent generational perhaps, but the people who do the best peer reviews, I think studies would suggest, are those in the middle of their career. So the middle people are reviewing the work of the younger people, and those younger people eventually become middle people, and so on and so forth. One comment that you've kind of got me going now. One comment that I've heard from others, which is, I don't publish anymore, so I don't bother peer reviewing. It's like, well, hang on a minute. There was a stage in your life when you published and you didn't review very much. So it's giving back.
Yeah, but the balance is a bit unbalanced, because I think everybody in this room probably reviews more paper than they publish, with the exception of Sue probably. But,
exactly that. But what you're forgetting is there probably was a phase of your career when you may have published more than you reviewed. So now it's payback time. You're telling me I'm old? My point. You're not as old as me. So there's that element of it. Is it sustainable in the future? I don't know. I mean, one model in, I think, disciplines like mathematics and physics is the open review. Yeah. And that is something that has yet to be adopted in veterinary medicine, but that might be a process. Just before I shut up and allow someone else the microphone, the quality of reviewing. When I started as editor, I thought, okay, the first thing is we must get more resources for our reviewers. We must improve the quality. And the truth is, 4 years have elapsed, and I've finally got around to putting up one A4 sheet. It's definitely an aspiration. I think for an individual journal to do it probably isn't the answer, and we need to make collective efforts. There are good resources out there, and so forth. But I would love to have a similar session. This session we chose to focus on authors and writing. I would love to have a similar session perhaps sometime in the future, maybe at BEVA, maybe at some other convention, where we could delve into peer review. And I'm aware that I think hasn't ACVM relatively recently had review, or maybe ACVS. So you do see it in other conferences, and so I think it's a reiterative process. Can we punish individual reviewers if they do a bad one? No, of course we can't. Is it helpful to editors to know when people are disappointed in the review post? Extremely helpful. And how we might deal with that information, there's lots of ways. So I should probably hand over.
I think from my point of view, I would agree with most of what Celia said. I think the peer review process is far from ideal, but it's probably the best system we have available at this moment. The quality of the review is quite extraordinary, how varied the kind of quality of the reviews you get in. And the differences of opinion is quite interesting. It's very, I don't know whether it's the same with the other editors, but it's quite common to get completely conflicting views from two different reviewers about the same paper. One will say reject, or recommend rejection, and one will say accept or minor revision. And under those circumstances, I always try and get at least one other opinion, but that has the impact on the time to publication and so on. And I feel guilty about sending out reviews. I feel guilty about chasing reviewers. I tend to know who is going to provide a timely, good quality review, and I tend to overuse those people, I'm afraid. But I guess it's up to you guys. If we ask you to review and you don't want to do it, then you say no, that's fine. I don't hold that against you.
Yeah, I think the sustainability is a good question because it is time consuming, and you see it in responses. You'll get a lot more people, and you do it yourself. There's a lot of times where I'll say no, and particularly these days, of course, when it's not for EVJ, because when you have responsibilities in a reviewing capacity, anything else outside that field you tend to leave. But you get a lot of turn downs. I think there is sometimes a correlation with the paper. If they look at the abstract and they don't like it, they're also more likely to say no, and it delays the whole process. And so where you get complaints that it took ages, it's because we had to ask 6 reviewers, and one, it can be a bad abstract or a bad paper, and 2, it can be the beginning of the summer holidays. And it sounds really stupid, but behaviour is that people deliver their papers just before the holiday because it's, wow, and now I'm going away and I've got it all finished, and everyone else is going away, so no one wants to review it. The way that you could try and get around it, and what some of the bigger scientific journals do, is a pretty brutal review process where they ask you, is this paper fundamentally flawed? And the answer is more or less yes or no. And if you've got one yes, they're probably not even going to look at it. And there is very little comment. So it's quick, it's easy, you get very little feedback. So I think all the journals here give through the reviewers, we get a lot of feedback. And I agree with what everyone else said. There's a huge amount. I don't know what you call quality. Sometimes a short, sharp, snappy review can be high quality. So a two-liner can be a fantastic review because they really hit at the point and say, it cannot be published, or I don't recommend because of this. And that's it. And that can sometimes be better than 4 pages detailing every tiny little fault. So quality isn't the same as quantity in a review. And most of them are trying to help. And you do get the option to have preferred, non-preferred. So if you really think someone has a conflict with you and are going to reject your paper, you can flag them up as non-preferred. Becomes difficult when you have 10 non-preferred listed, because then which happens.
Don't put the editors as non-preferred. I'm afraid you don't get to choose them.
But I agree with the others that, quality of information anyway with the internet is a big issue, because you can publish anything you like now because you put it in Wikipedia, and there's no control over whether it is true. And peer review isn't perfect. You see, all the big scientific journals have had major issues with whatever fraud, plagiarism, things which are downright wrong and have had to be retracted, and sometimes retracted 5 years later. So it's not perfect, but it serves a useful purpose, I think.
I think it's actually amusing that you mentioned Wikipedia, because there is actually a Nature paper on how Wikipedia compares to some very well-known encyclopedic books, and they're actually doing pretty good. So
Wikipedia.
Don't knock it.
I mean, I guess at least it does have the advantage that people can get back and change it again. But you can put in what you like and you can mess it around, and you need to be careful about believing it's gospel. That's the same as all research, but at least you know someone else has looked.
Okay. Yeah.
Quick word.
Yeah.
I'm playing on the wing here, so I got to wait for the ball to come down. This side. Your question seems a long time ago, Renata, but it was along the lines of, should you continue to review?
No, it was about the sustainability.
Is it sustainable? I'll tell you why I continue to do it. It's simply because it's educational, and of course it works both ways. I find it really interesting to receive a manuscript and have to make up my mind about it, and very often I'll have to kind of unpack what I've been presented with and get down to the nitty-gritty of, what's the aim of this, and do the methods really address that aim, and are the conclusions valid? You know, and of course, having gone through that and produced a report that I tried to make balanced and to emphasize those big things rather than the piddly little typo details, then I'm hoping that it's educational back to the authors as well, many of whom, you know, in the general scheme of things, tend to be residents, sometimes producing their first paper, and who need guidance because God knows they haven't got it from their supervisor.
I don't know that there's much left to say. It's not a perfect process, but it's the best we've got. It is sustainable because, you know, while we might occasionally struggle to find reviewers, every paper that's published in the journals that are represented here has been reviewed by at least two people. Renata, I'd say if you're spending 2 days doing a review, you're spending way too much time. I think that the first pass on an article should probably not take anybody more than an hour or a couple of hours, because the key question is there a fatal flaw? And if there is, you don't go any further, you stop. Now we try and give at JVIM give that explicit instruction to reviewers, and everybody ignores it. They say it's fatally flawed, and then they give us a longer review. So I think being judicious with the time of the I think we need to be respectful of what we ask reviewers to do, and reviewers also need to think about, well, how much time do I really need to put into this? And I quite honestly sometimes groan when I see the 4-page review come back in of 100 dot points, because that's excessive. That's not needed. Let us do the copy editing. Just tell us whether this paper is fundamentally okay, and if it's fundamentally okay, what needs to be improved, but don't go into too much detail. So I applaud your effort, but counsel you not to put that much effort into it.
Okay, great. I did read recently that apparently about 20% of Wikipedia is written by computer algorithms, not people.
Really?
So there you go.
Where did you read that, in Google?
No, it was in one of the newspapers, which is probably wrong then. Okay, we've got a question here.
Richard Piercy from the Royal Veterinary College. Actually, it's a question that relates to the previous discussion. Celia, Equine Veterinary Journal has moved to blinded review for both the reviewers and authors, and I'd be interested to hear your comments about how that process has improved the journal, if it has, and also the other editors' comments about whether they've considered that for their journal, and if not, why not?
Okay, I'm going to try to be diplomatic here, but when I took over as editor, one of the first things I did was go to the AAP Congress, and I spoke to a number of different people there about their impression of EVJ. And how can I put this? The further you got from Newmarket, the more concern was raised that possibly there was some sort of gradient
Bias.
Gradient bias. And and it's true actually, and it's very difficult for me actually. If you look at a lot of EVJ is fairly racehorse orientated, and it's hard for me to see that, because for all that I like to go on about being from Scotland and so forth, that is the world in which I live, you know, it's right there all around me. So I think it can be hard to see that. So I thought maybe it's more perception than reality. We all know that you can guess in small fields. You may have been at conferences and seen the abstract submitted and so forth. But that was the motivation. We had a few hiccups getting it going. The office staff had a lot of concerns. The way that it works is that basically the papers come in, they're screened by office staff. If they notice blinding mistakes, they send them back. But if it comes back a second time without some still things left, we think, well, we gave the authors a chance, they obviously don't care about it, we proceed on. So we try not to let it become a delaying factor. Sometimes reviewers say to me, you know what, I know who's written this, what should I do? I tend to take a view, it's on a case-by-case basis. But to answer the question, have I noticed any difference? Unfortunately, I'm not really in that position because I didn't work with the old system for very long.
From Eve's point of view, we don't blind. We've discussed it on several occasions and on the editorial board, and came to the conclusion that the advantages probably didn't exceed the disadvantages in terms of time and effort from our point of view. But it's something that's on the agenda to discuss again. I think it is a very small profession. We all know what, well, most of us know what other people are doing, and in terms of Eve content, you can pretty much guess where most papers have come from, even if they were blinded.
I wrote an
You can always guess,
Yeah,
almost
no, you
invariably, and it
can't
just takes a
actually.
whole lot more time as an author.
Well, why would you want to guess? There is a bunch of research done in medicine, obviously, looking at that, and actually about half the time they guess, they're wrong. My experience, I don't have those statistics, but I certainly do know that about half the time I get emails and conversations, whether it's formal or informal, our authors would also appear to be wrong.
At JVIM, Steve Debart and I talk about this every year, and we talk about it with the editorial board, and we decide not to do it, partly because, for the reasons that have been discussed that Tim pointed out, we don't see the benefit in it. There may be some, but it's not clearly a benefit. It's a greater effort, and for those reasons, we're agnostic about it. So because we're agnostic, we're not going to change for the time being. When there's good evidence that it improves the outcome, then we'll do it.
And when you say it's a greater effort, Ken, is that predominantly within the editorial part of the journal or elsewhere?
Well, for both authors, having had several manuscripts submitted through EVJ recently, you have to go through and be quite careful. If you want to be ensure that you're blinded, that the reviewers are blinded, you have to be quite careful about it. Even down to how you cite some of your own previous work can be a bit of a challenge. So there's some work there, and then there's the editorial office. If next year, I could see a situation next year where at our editorial board meeting, the majority of the board says we should do this, we'll do it. It's not something I'd die in the ditches over, absolutely. But I just don't see the benefit in going there at the moment.
Chris, you want to add something? Okay. Can I perhaps we just have a show of hands, just to make it more interactive. If you're an author and you're submitting, what proportion of people would want to be able to anonymise their paper? Let me see. If you want to, put your hands up. Okay, and if you don't want to, put your hand up.
None of you are in North America.
Okay.
But the same would apply submitting to a journal in North America, because I don't fundamentally think it makes any difference, because if you're familiar with the field, the reviewer knows who you are, and I don't really think it makes any difference.
I think I was trying to be different. I think it was an EVJ specific problem, and maybe in a little while we won't feel it's a problem anymore.
Can I comment on that? I mean, as part of the study design and data analysis board, many people on that are kind of removed from the day-to-day. We are quite different, and more often than not, I don't know who it is. I will admit my ignorance. And as a reviewer, I actually kind of prefer that. I don't want to be wondering whether I'm being biased by knowing that such and such works there and they're fantastic, or this has been done in practice and maybe there's some issues or something like that.
I mean, I think that's a good point, and where Celia was saying earlier, a lot of the better reviewers are younger. They may not know everyone, or they will know them, but they might not know it's their work unless the name and the institute is separate. So reviewers may feel less intimidated, or will be more likely to give an honest opinion.
So, I mean, I've certainly been in conversations where somebody says, and this is not about reviewing a paper, this is just a general conversation, that, well, so-and-so is an author on this paper, therefore it must be right. And I think that's a very flawed argument.
I'm I'm going to probably say something I'm going to regret now, but we do have a plan to do a user survey and try to evaluate just these sort of issues. And as I've indicated, the decision to blind came out of informal canvassing of opinion. Maybe if we can start canvassing a little bit more formally, we might, nothing is set in stone. I tried to give that impression in my talk about ethics. We might change, but I'm not inclined to change today.
Sue, one more question.
I'd just like to kind of raise for discussion a philosophical point about reviewing, of which I do quite a lot. And I always have the philosophy that people have put a lot of effort into preparing something which they think is good. And I, as a reviewer, if there's a fatal flaw, yes, I want to identify that and say this is a fatal flaw, reject it without spending too much time. But a lot of papers are not like that, but they do require a lot of work. But I would always have the philosophy, I would like to try to help the people to get to the stage when it is published. And I get the impression from some of the other reviews that I read, when I've reviewed a paper and one or two other people have read it, that many other reviewers don't have that same philosophy in terms of trying to get to the end point with the papers. Or they get bored partway through and they're pissed off because some of their comments weren't dealt with, and then they go into really negative mode. And I just wonder if we should be developing some form of guidelines in terms of the philosophy about what we're trying to achieve through reviewing. Discuss.
Okay, I can start off. We have guidelines for reviewers. I doubt they're ever read. I honestly doubt they ever read. That's, I shouldn't say they're never read, but we don't see consistent evidence that the reviewers for JVIM actually read the instructions for reviewers before they do review their article. So I think it's we're dealing with people who recognise the point. I recognise your point, and that comes down to the variable quality of the review. Some people obviously invest a lot of time and effort and goodwill in it. Others come to it with their own agenda. Others, they're busy. The kids need to be taken to football, and I've got half an hour to do this review. I'll get it out today, sort of thing. So there's all sorts of things in life that come back, and especially when it's anonymous to the authors. So the reviewer, the only people who know that Ken Hinchcliffe's an awful reviewer are the few editors who send me papers to review. So my department chairman, my boss, is never going to know that I'm an awful reviewer. So there's really no consequences to how you do a review. A rambling series of thoughts, which reflects my perspective that we're just dealing with people, and as with all people, there's going to be populations of people. There's going to be a variety of responses.
One tiny point. There is one potential consequence, at least for EVJ. Bad reviewers get flagged up as not to be used. So the potential consequence, if they're obviously unfair, or they, there can be other reasons that they don't respond for 6 months, or they come up with something which has obviously taken no effort, they haven't read it, and they've just put a one-liner in, then you would flag them up as do not use this person ever again. Again, not all journalists do that.
That's not a solution. That only means that the people who do deliver reviews on time and do deliver constructive reviews get used more and more.
I agree, it's unfair, but
I really think that definitely EVJ should be thinking of helping people to become better reviewers and train them.
Have you read our reviewer guidelines?
Absolutely not. But then, are you telling me I'm a bad reviewer?
No.
Okay.
I'm being mean because they only went up about a month ago.
in an ideal world, I think you're right, but it does, as Ken said, it relies on people wanting to be a better reviewer.
But
there is definitely a need for some similar events to this. But
And I guess maybe your original point, what are the incentives to a reviewer, apart from it can be interesting to read, to be one of the first people to read someone else's work? or educational or altruistic, but are there other incentives, and could you build in incentives? Indirectly or directly, there aren't any.
No, there are not any, but coming back to your comment, I have one advantage over many other people, and I know several people in the room have the same advantage. I have training in research. I've gone through a PhD program, which obviously inherently trains you to produce research, write it up, and also critically evaluate it.
Sure.
We are using clinicians who don't have that advantage. So I think it's unfair to expect from those people to have inherently, I don't know, from, it came down from the sky to have that skill, because it is a skill. And I would hate to lose those people, because obviously they, in a way, are also the target audience, or if you want to put it that way. So I really think to just write guidelines and say, read those guidelines and we'll be able to do it, I mean, that's just naive.
I wouldn't agree. I don't think it's naive. I think the guidelines, and I haven't read your guidelines yet, Celia, but I haven't reviewed for you recently. Hint, hint. The guidelines that we provide step people through it, and if they follow those through, then that provides the skeleton for how to do a review. Now, not everybody's trained, has done a PhD or has done a residency where they've actually sat through journal clubs and heard articles discussed and dissected in detail. But working through those is a good start. I think these sorts of forums where we could talk about what constitutes a good review and what doesn't would be really important, are really important. But the start is, it's like cooking, read the recipe, and that'll help you make a good cake.
I think Sue's, where we started from, that was a good point. I mean, I think we probably all know what we need from a good review. We need the reviewer to clearly express an opinion about the value of the work. If there are faults, what could the authors do to correct those? Okay, big faults or small faults. That's what you really want. Now, this isn't rocket science, is it? But you don't have to have done a PhD to learn how to do this. You need practice at it. You need exposure, and you need some training. And going back to what Renata asked before about sustainability, I think that just as you stop asking for reviews from the reviewers you perceive as substandard, it must be possible to reward the good ones. Some kind of recognition. I mean...
Do you know what they got from us?
I'm sorry?
Well, I'll tell you what they get from us. A Christmas card.
Well, I mean, there must be some way of giving them something more substantial than that.
Well, don't admit to that.
Just the good review.
I mean,
We keep the red flags private.
So for example, correct me if I'm wrong, the EVJ is the official journal of BEVA.
Yeah.
Well, so why don't the star reviewers get free registration at the BEVA conference? That's not going to cost BEVA anything. Get on with it.
In terms of teaching people how to review, I mean, everyone we're asking is a trained scientist or a trained vet. They all have a degree, and certainly in the course that we have, our teaching course, we try and teach students to critically appraise the literature, because otherwise you can't understand whether something that you've read is something you can believe. So maybe it's not the focus that the journals should be teaching. A lot of it is in the education process, and we do need to train young veterinarians or scientists how to critically appraise literature, and therefore also teaching them how to review.
Are you seriously suggesting that critically reviewing a scientific paper should be a day one skill?
I think it should be part of your training protocol. Absolutely, yeah. I'm seriously suggesting it, and it's certainly part of our education program.
And you think new graduates can do that?
No,
Renata, you forget that exact problem is part of the finals at the Royal Veterinary College.
It is indeed, but we all know that exam results do not equal real life, don't we, Chris?
I wouldn't for a moment claim that all of them are competent at the point of day one entry, but I would also suggest that that's true of another other skills that we consider to be day one competencies, we all know that people will learn an awful lot in the first 6 months after they get out of vet school.
Okay. What we might do is just bring discussion of review to a bit of an end, because we've spent some time on it, and maybe go back slightly earlier in the well, actually what I will do is offer people on the floor a chance to address some other issues around publication, around writing for publication, but also perhaps for just getting going in research. We had a number of people here who haven't yet published, but are planning to. So perhaps they've got particular concerns or issues that they're worried about through the writing process, through the submission process, or whatever. So does anybody want to raise a different topic for... Got one at the back there.
Hi, I'm Poppy. I'm a student, finally a student. I've got a question about case reports, because at school we are told that even as first opinion vets, we have, and we should and we can contribute to science by publishing case reports. One example this morning drew my attention in a lecture where it was about corticosteroid-induced laminitis, which is something that we would expect a lot of cases should be reported, and there was only 3. So I'm asking, as a potential future first opinion vet, if I have an interesting case I want to report, what would the approach be? And how do you as reviewers view case reports, even if it's a couple or even maybe a single case?
Thank you. I think that's a really good question, and a really topical one, an important one. And I guess the spread of the editors here might have differing views from their perspective. So I'll hand over to Ken, and I don't know if you want to use your slides or not.
We could, sorry? Yes, I'm being told to.
Okay.
Got a couple of slides on this.
Okay, over to you. I think it just should run on.
That was, no. We would have. So probably your question is a really good one, because it really gets to the importance of what you're publishing or what you want to publish. And we've had some private conversations around these, and there's a couple of things to think about here, and I've just got a couple of prepared slides. And one of the things is that most veterinary articles are not cited, so really, does anybody care about those? So let's answer that question. So we're going to use those little Turn-It-In buttons, and if you'd put them in your right hand, and what I'm going to ask you to do is raise your right hand if you've read an article in the last year. Okay, thank you. That looks to me like about 24. And I'd ask you to raise, again with the Turn-It-In button in your hand, raise your hand if you have cited an article in the last year. Oh, that didn't do quite the result that I was expecting. So we'll just ignore that. You weren't quite, so you're all authors, so that's probably the case. So a lot of you did. So that was, the majority of people had read more articles than they'd cited. And the reason I'm getting to that is, well, what makes it important? And what's important, I think, is that when is work read? So we're writing because we want people to read what we're saying. If they happen to cite it further on, well, your department chair would probably be happy about that. But really, aren't you more interested, aren't we more interested as authors in the fact that people are reading? And I think the actually citation rates are probably are anachronistic, and that over the next few years we'll see that people moving away from them. We're already seeing that. And actually what will be used in promotion documents and things like that will be downloads. And how many times was my article read? This is what was the downloads for 2013 for the Journal of Vet Internal Medicine. Now, you know, we publish for all the sort of companion animal species of domestic animals. So there's not a lot of horse-related articles there. But you can see the sort of things that people read. And those are, almost 9,000 or 8,000 downloads. And that article, portal hypertension, I don't know how many times it was cited, but I'll bet if it was cited 20 times, I'd probably be exaggerating. So what people read is not necessarily what they cite. In the top 100 articles that are downloaded for JVIM last year, there were no case reports. We published about 200 articles last year, 13 of them were case reports. So, you know, case reports, you'd expect them to be in the top 100, and they're not. So, and these are the sort of download numbers that we're looking at. So what's read is these sorts of things: consensus statements, methods papers, and that's why, you know, we all like to publish the occasional consensus statement or review article, because it improves our performance on that anachronistic measure, the impact factor. So these are the sorts of things that are really read. But you know what? So then I pulled out case reports and whether they're downloaded. And these are the case reports that we published in 2013 that have been downloaded up until last Friday, I think it was. And even though we're saying, oh, they're not in the top 100, almost 500 people read that article, downloaded that article on identification and surgical ligation of an aortic pulmonary vascular malformation in something or other dogs. So people are interested in these sort of things. So they are read. You know, if you go down and look about 4 or 5 from the bottom, disease remission in a horse with EHV5 associated lymphoma. I don't remember who the authors were. Perhaps they're in the room. And I remember when that came across my desk, I thought, oh, gee, you know, is this something that we should publish? Not. Well, it was associated with the administration of an antiviral drug. I can't remember. It was probably acyclovir. Antiviral drug. I thought, oh yeah, maybe. Well, look at this. Almost within less than a year of it being published, 400 people have read that paper. So presumably, that's sufficient interest. So I've advocated strongly in JVIM board meetings that we really reduce the number of case reports that we're publishing. But these sorts of numbers make me want to reconsider that. Where it comes down to, Poppy, from your perspective, is if you've got something that's unique and that provides some information that's not already in the literature. If it's just another quirk, right dorsal colitis in a zebra, well, we don't really care, because that's probably, you know, that's to be expected. But if it's something really unusual and novel, you give a horse with EHV5 associated lymphoma acyclovir and they can get better, that suddenly becomes pretty interesting. And it doesn't prove things, but it certainly provides some input. So, you know, I think I'll be quiet after this slide, but what makes it relevant is that it's actually relevant. The question pertinent is it's relevant to a wider audience. The science, or at least the observation of the sound, is sound, and that it's likely to be something that people will use, that there's some external validity about it. So right dorsal colitis in a zebra with being given phenylbutazone, no, nobody's really not going to change things. Maybe giving acyclovir to treat herpes virus in lymphoma in horses might be something we can look at in the future. I remember Peter Rosdale saying once that we're talking about what you reject or not. He said he didn't want to be the person who rejected the paper on aspirin's effect on platelet function. This was in people, because that paper was rejected a number of times in human literature before it was finally published. Sentinel paper, absolutely sentinel paper. You don't want to reject the sentinel paper. Not that they're going to be case reports. So anyway, I think I'll stop there on case reports.
Thank you.
Oh, no, what I can do is I can provide a couple, because Richard's sitting here in the audience.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and I can speak from some personal experience. One of my first case publications was a case report on gentamicin nephrotoxicity in a cow, Poppy. So what? Every species that we know of that you give gentamicin to develops nephrotoxicity if you do enough. Not important. But then, when Richard was with it as Ohio State, we saw 2 horses come in that had been administered human recombinant erythropoietin, and they were anemic and all that sort of thing. So we wrote it up, and it's been cited 40 times, which is a reasonable number of times, because that demonstrated a new association of the disease, a new cause of the disease and a potential association, and of course that went on to be pretty well documented by others. So there are reasons to publish case reports, but you have to be really careful and judicious about it.
Thanks, Ken. Maybe Tim might like to give a perspective from Equine Veterinary Education.
I guess from Eve's point of view, we have a slightly different approach to case reports, and I don't have download figures to give you, but certainly all the surveys we've done of Eve readers, and that is BEVA members primarily and AAP members, whenever we've questioned the use of case reports and suggested that we reduce them, they say no, we want case reports. These are what are particular interest to practitioners, the case reports and the accompanying clinical commentaries that we provide. So there seems to be an interest in our readership to have case reports. I personally think they are a valuable resource as well. As Ken said, when they provide novel information, even about common diseases, and we do publish case reports that give a different slant or a different angle on a disease or treatment or something, and I think that's important that gets out into the wider community. Again, we are a small profession, and we don't see lots of all the same cases, most of us, unless you're a really specialist practice or working in a specialist area. So it's important that this information is disseminated to the practitioner. So we are supportive of publishing exactly the sort of stuff you're discussing.
Just one other comment in support of case reports. I imagine that when your typical JAVMA reader picks it up every month, what's your diagnosis is going to be one of the things they routinely flick to, the clinicians. And those are essentially case reports, but with an educational angle, aren't they? I mean, the whole reason to publish is education, really. And there's a specific, kind of topic that might be worth considering. I think we've all been there. We've all done case reports, and we probably did it when we were relatively junior, and it was a useful thing. It was part of learning how to write. So there is a place for them, although clearly, you're not going to have a big impact with them.
The other thing comes about, Poppy, from a publisher's point of view. We've got a page budget, so we can publish a certain number of pages in a year. And if I have the option of publishing an article that's going to get 8,000 downloads or an article that's going to get 400, I know which I'll do. So it does become a resourcing issue.
But I guess a key point that's emerged there is that different journals have different audiences and different agenda, and so it's about thinking about where you would submit that. And I think coming back to Celia's comment in the last presentation is let's think about your audience. So what's the purpose? What is this for? Who will read this and who will be interested and why? And then how do I communicate that to that person? Okay. What about comments from the floor? Does anybody want to? Because clearly, I think case reports will be here to stay.
Just one comment, really. I mean, I remember when I was starting out in my career, there's no doubt that I found reading case reports very much easier. And as a result, I read them and I understood because it was what I was used to doing on a clinical basis every day. And as I've become more experienced and now obviously I'm in academia, I can understand some of the other papers that are published. So I think very, very much it's a case of the readership that is looking at it and also relative experience of the reader.
Yeah, absolutely. Getch.
I'm Getch from the Donkey Sanctuary. I think, from the discussion what we had so far, I think it seems for me that it is actually limited, maybe only to UK or maybe other developed countries, because a country where I came from, Ethiopia, such clinical cases are really vital and very important because we are not exposed, or our students are not exposed. But if they get such resources out there for them, it is really very, very important. I think we have to see from a worldwide perspective, not restrict ourselves. Their valuability, they are quite invaluable.
Quick comment. Earlier in the session, Celia, when she was speaking, referred to the fact that quality of English can be an inhibiting factor in getting papers published. There's some other evidence on this. I know of at least 2 studies that have demonstrated that if you compare where papers come from, if papers submitted, manuscripts submitted from non-primary English-speaking countries do not suffer a higher rate of rejection because of poor standard of English, except for China, apparently, in one study. But for my journal, Vet Radiology, that's not a factor. So I guess I just thought that may be relevant. You know, you're looking at the worldwide perspective. Authors from non-primary English-speaking countries might assume that they've got an extra hurdle. Well, the evidence isn't that there is an extra hurdle.
Midge, was there did I see you raise a hand?
Melissa from the Brook. I was just going to second what Getch was saying about thinking about vets working in developing countries. I'll just say that a couple of our vets from India last year managed to get a couple of case reports accepted to be presented at Voorjaarsdagen in Amsterdam. And the benefits they got from actually having the opportunity to write up their case in a format for Voorjaarsdagen and present it and then get questioned about it by a very European stroke American-centric vet audience was amazing. So if there's opportunities for those kind of case studies to get into something like EVJ, yes, we appreciate that the audience is somewhat limited because, you know, someone who works in Newmarket's going to look at a case in Delhi and go, you know, what's that got to do with me? But for their benefit, bringing them on as, you know, evidence-based clinicians later on, the benefits are huge. So I would just, you know, second that or leave that as a thought for other people later on, because they're the vets. You know, our vets in this country need to learn how to do evidence-based medicine, but boy, the vets in the developing countries, they don't get taught in an evidence-based way. So bringing them on to understand how that works is a massive challenge. So, you know, the more chances they get to do that, the better, really.
Okay. Well, I guess the nature of case reports is that they're contextualized. They're you know, relevant to the situation in which they occurred. So, you know, for example, for the Ethiopian context, seeing cases where not only maybe the causes are different of a particular disease, but the resources available to manage a particular disease might be different. So it actually does potentially present an interesting case scenario. Finding that the journal that will accept it, you know, it doesn't. It certainly means it may have a considerable value, but you know, you need to find the right journal for that perspective as well.
There are more and more case report journals coming along.
Absolutely.
That's one. Wiley's got a new one. So I think we're going to find actually more opportunities for case report rather than doing.
So absolutely. So I think, you know, that could be a really positive thing. Okay. Any other areas that we want to delve into from the floor? Thanks, Richard.
I'd be very interested in the panel's opinion of a conflict that I see and deal with, you know, when I submit papers, and that is that I am judged as an academic primarily by the level of impact factor publication that I can get, and the higher the better as far as my bosses are concerned. Now, I know that if I can therefore get it into a human medical journal, it's likely to be a higher impact factor, but that's not necessarily going to achieve the readership. So I'm sure you've all got ideas and comments. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I entirely recognise that, and obviously, you know, I completely understand how that might be. It's a very small initiative on EVJ's part, but the way that we've tried to address that is I sort of view the journal as a kind of conduit of trying to deliver clinically relevant science information to our readers, members of BEVA, what have you. So while there are papers that we couldn't possibly aspire to get because they're going to go into the high impact factor journals, if I hear about those, then I might ask the authors to write, after they've published in the major high impact journal they're going to, write a short editorial explaining the relevance of their research. Now, examples of that would be Etienne O'Brien wrote some stuff on tendon-related research. We call them science in brief. Steph Dakin did the same, and you're beginning to see a little pattern emerging. because of my other hats that I wear, I tend to know about research that's relevant to racing. And so therefore, those are the ones I know about. Those are the ones jet lag in horses, another example. What I would really love is if people like you would let us know you've recently published something of clinical relevance, you've got your high impact factor, your boss is happy, your CV is looking in good order. Then if you would write 1,000 words for why the clinicians should know about it, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much it really hits on the clinical research, but I get your point, and we all, as an academic, everyone suffers the same. Some of that may change in the future. I mean, impact factor is a limited assessment of quality of a journal. I mean, it tells you something. You should, and it's difficult, and it depends on who assesses you. But long run, it's more important how often it's read and how often it's cited. And there are figures on citations of individual papers, of course. And it's easier now because you can find everything through a search engine. But it's quite possible in the future things will move more away from did you publish in a high impact factor journal to how many citations has your paper got. And that's surely more important than the average for a journal that you submitted to, and hopefully it will get out to the right readership then.
So Richard, to throw it back to you, why did you publish the case report on vacuolar myopathy in neuromuscular diseases?
Because it's got a higher impact factor.
Yeah. And the flip side is that I found it on a search. So, and it didn't require me having access to the University of Melbourne database to find it on the search to get the article it did. But Google, myopathy, horses, comes up. So I think, I applaud what EVJ is doing around the science in brief. We don't do that with JVIM, maybe we should. But I think from an individual author's point of view, I counsel authors publish the paper, the article, in the best journal that you can, best being looking at the audience and considering your own particular predicament in the sense of the situation you work in, and publish it. Because unlike 25 years ago, where if you published an article in the Journal of Applied Physiology, no one would see it, or few clinicians would see it. Now, if you publish a journal in an article there, as Ed Robinson's group did just recently on EIPH and the veno-occlusive remodeling, comes up in searches. So I think I've probably said enough. And you answered my question. Thank you.
It's an interesting question because, it comes from the impact factor. It's not a very good name, is it, impact factor, for what it is. It's simply the ratio of the number of times articles from a journal have been cited within the following 2 years of them being published. And of course that isn't necessarily a good thing. It's got nothing to do with the impact of the articles that are being cited. It's not a measure of their quality, it's just scientific snob value. And if promotions committees and your boss, Richard, really care about that, then I sympathise. But it's ridiculous.
We have the same boss.
It's so but it's never bugged me about impact factor, right? And it's so easy. Don't be rude. It's so easy to find examples of papers that have been downright destructive, but they've been cited thousands of times and boosted the impact factor of the journals that should never have published them in the first place.
I was just as an illustration of that. The first time I was looking at the data I was given by Wiley on the number of citations in EVJ in the last year and so forth, I was looking at a paper that was reasonably high up the list. And I thought, blimey, why on earth has that one got great citations? It's been trashed by everybody. And as the words came out of my mouth, loads of people were citing it, in which they were criticising it. So the citations are what they are, but that's the story.
Okay. Anybody want to take that topic a little further? We've got just a few moments left, so if anybody has that burning question that they really did hope that somebody would raise, now's the time to do it. Yeah, let's have a bit more fun with our things. Just want to scroll forward. You can do that. So let's ponder an ethical dilemma.
We'll ponder the clinical one, yeah? So we'll skip through the...
Skipping Australia.
Okay. Yeah, this is just an ethical dilemma. So it's a clinical paper. I had an experimental one, but it's kind of easier. So what I've got here is little sections from initially the summary. So the summary was to describe the anatomy of the epiploic foramen, etc., etc. You can read it as I can. They had two elements, a cadaver study and a laparoscopy. They had 32 horses in their cadaver study, and they had there's laparoscopic images from 6 horses, and they concluded various things. So that's the summary. We have to go to the methods to find out a little bit more. So the laparoscopy, which I see I can't spell, they got that from 6 clinical cases undergoing ovarectomy or cryptorchectomy. So as far as I can understand, and from a medical point of view, looking backwards in the horse, and then they sedated them, they put analgesia in there, they did infiltration, and while the local anaesthetic was taking effect, they swung the laparoscope round and looked forwards. And this is the information that we were given in our thing about, the question that we asked at the time, which I have had to change because it's not a very good question, but we'd had one big question essentially asking about the ethical and, the ethical review and so forth. So I guess I would ask you, what do you think the issues are here that might have troubled the editors? Do you want to see the info again? Nobody can spot any problems. There are obviously problems, otherwise it wouldn't be a dilemma. What do we need to know?
I guess whether the informed consent was... Hi, Claire Wiley from Rossdales. Whether the informed consent was actually to do the extra experimental part of the procedure, or whether the owners knew that was going to happen and they'd informed that, or whether they'd just given consent for the actual procedure that was necessary.
Right, so is it an extra procedure?
I would say yes. I could be wrong.
Did they say how much longer the procedure took them because they were doing this additional viewing?
No, but that would be a reasonable question to ask. Any other questions one would ask?
And is there a greater morbidity around the incision site, having directed the laparoscope in more than one direction?
Again, because all 6 horses in the study underwent the same procedure, there was no comparison, but I think, to be fair, they did say in the results that they noticed no problems over what they would have expected anyway. But yeah, complications, side effects would have been an important point. What about the cadavers? Are we happy with the cadavers? Yeah, this is pretty much all we know about the cadavers. So the horse is subjected to euthanasia unrelated.
Were the horses subject to euthanasia by the person doing the study?
They were just horses going through the post-mortem room.
Did the owners give consent for the cadaver to be used for research purposes? What did their consent form for euthanasia say?
That's what it said. Have you got any other issues? I'm supposed to be being quick here. How quickly do I have to wind up? I feel like I'm dragging out of you, but yeah, you've all sort of hit on all of the issues really. I didn't actually. These are the questions I asked. In terms of the cadaver study, we don't even know if there was owner-informed consent for the post-mortem exam, but I guess let's assume there was. But if there was consent for post-mortem, some people would say that you should have specifically asked for additional consent because the body was being used in research. So can we have a show of hands on that one? You know, so we all know that it happens frequently. You know, a horse dies of colic, goes through the post-mortem room, and somebody removes its limb from the knee downwards. Do we need to ask about that? While they bimble off to the MRI unit or the QTC or whatever it's called. There are countless examples of that being published in EVJ. Is that good or bad? Do we care? Justin doesn't care.
Where I come from, Finland, we can't take any parts if we haven't had the consent from the owners. So we always ask them if the horse just comes for like euthanasia, nothing like other problems with the horse. We always ask them if they want to consent that the horse may be used in research or teaching purposes, and only those carcasses can we use. But then when they have consent to that, they consent the whole horse, so we can take any parts of the horse for any study or anything. But if they just consent for pathology, or if they don't consent to anything, then we will not use them, any part of them.
Yeah. I think it would be true to say it probably varies from institution to institution and practice to practice at the moment in the UK, but this is the sort of scenario where I think perhaps an opt-out might help us. So obviously I think we probably all agree that there should have been consent for the post-mortem exam. Anyone going to argue with me over that? But perhaps it would have been helpful if the owners had had at least some inkling that tissues might be saved for research and teaching purposes, or I think the Animal Health Trust uses an opt-out in that scenario, but I don't know that everybody does. But, you know, when I was talking about opt-outs earlier, this is perhaps something that we could in future see opt-outs being used, or maybe we should raise our standard even further and say, unless we're in the situation that you are, we're not interested. But so that's the cadaver bit. The laparoscopy, I think, you know, Claire kind of got straight to the point, really. The first thing we've got to debate is this actually an additional experimental procedure? Does this come under in what we would call, you know, under the Home Office regulations or not? And I actually did ask a Home Office inspector, and as you might guess, I got a long answer, but of course, you know, they're not going to give you a yes or no type answer, and it basically boiled down to, obviously, if you were planning it ahead of time, you would consult with the Home Office and argue back and forth, but they did point out that if you take it down to the level of the blood sample, putting the needle in through the skin is the act that they are issuing the license for. If you take a little bit extra of blood and go off and do something else, the Home Office is not interested in that. But there was concern over the idea. What seemed to would have made a big difference was if there had to be a second hole. If there was a second hole, absolutely no doubt about it, that would be requiring Home Office approval. The fact that it was done through one hole seemed to make things a little bit different. But the first point is this research or not? Or is this experimental or not? And then that leads on to, well, if it is experimental, there would be different legal requirements in the different countries concerned. The next questions that I had was, did the owners actually know that this was happening? That they were going like that and then like that? You can understand why I'm not a surgeon. And if they did know, did they understand that that process was just for research? And finally, I was asking what the Institutional Ethical Committee's view is. I'm not going to give you all the nuances of it. I can tell you it was published in EVJ and is currently available on Early View. It wasn't performed in the UK, and we did establish that all the legal requirements and so forth were in place. I think that's all I'm going to say. Well, does anyone have any more questions about that little dilemma? No. Good.
Thank you very much. So we've just slightly gone over 5 o'clock, which was our finishing time. So I guess I will draw the session to a close. Thank you all very much for your attendance and your participation, and thank our panel for their excellent contributions as well. We had a lot of slides prepared, as you saw, but we were hoping we wouldn't need to use them, and really we didn't, which is fantastic. So thank you all very much.
Okay.